We're delighted to welcome Margit Rowell this evening to discuss her new book, Reinventing Sculpture. I'm sorry, Luciano Fabro. Maybe I should wear my glasses. Luciano Fabro, Reinventing Sculpture, out from Monticelli. Margit Rowell is an art historian, writer, and curator who, since the late 60s, has held key curatorial posts at prestigious public institutions such as the Guggenheim Museum in New York, the Fundació Joan Miró in Barcelona, the Reina Sofia in Madrid, as well as the Centre Pompidou in Paris, and the Museum of Modern Art here in New York, where she was chief curator of drawings. She organized a retrospective in collaboration with Luciano Fabro at the Miró Foundation in 1990, and has contributed to several museum exhibition catalogs devoted to the artist, including the 1992 San Francisco MoMA retrospective and the 2015 Reina Sofia survey. She's curated too many other monographic and group exhibitions to mention, and is the author or co-author of numerous catalogs and books on 20th century artists, including Joan Miró, Ed Ruscha, and Julio Gonzalez, whose work she's a widely acknowledged expert. She's currently at work on a professional memoir detailing her years at the Guggenheim and elsewhere, working with artists like the aforementioned Miró and Gonzalez, but also Georgia O'Keeffe, Joseph Albers, Jean Dubuffet, and others. So watch this space for what promises to be an extraordinary book. She's joined for this conversation by Mathilde Guidelli-Guidi, who's the curatorial department head at the Dia Art Foundation, where she's organized exhibitions of work by Mario Mertz, Senga Ngudi, Fred Sandbach, Jack Whitten, Cameron Rowland, and others. She's currently at work on projects with Kishi Osuga and Dwayne Linklater for Dia. And she's also the curator of Dia's fantastic Artist on Artist lecture series. So thank you, Mathilde, for joining us. The seed for the Luciano Fabro book was planted in 2005 in a conversation between Rowell and Fabro. It was first conceived as an English anthology of Fabro's lectures and writings, but with Fabro's unexpected death in 2007, the need soon emerged to take stock of the artist's achievement and to adopt a vastly expanded perspective, allowing new audiences, and particularly English and American readers, to fully engage with the breadth and the complexity of his art. While Fabro is generally known to American art audiences for his connection to arte povera, and although SF MoMA presented a retrospective of his work in 1992, the unclassifiable nature of his work, its formal eclecticism, and its intricate philosophical underpinnings meant that a reliable, detailed, and insightful guide was sorely needed. Rowell's book was a long time coming, but it was well worth the wait because it more than delivers on all these counts. And it is also the most generously illustrated and beautifully designed artist monograph one can wish for. In 9 chapters, Rowell charts the course of Fabro's career and illuminates his dedication to reinventing sculpture. That is, quote, to reinvent the traditional premises of sculpture by attacking its own conventions. But while giving her full attention to Fabro's uniqueness, to his many eccentricities, idiosyncrasies, and anachronisms, she also brilliantly makes a case for Fabro's centrality in accounts of late 20th century Western art. She writes, I quote, "The lushness and metaphoric content of Fabro's work obscure a spectrum of underlying issues that were shared by many late 20th century sculptors in both Europe and the Americas. Fabro's main concerns: the visitor's direct physical experience of real as opposed to illusionistic space, the haptic quality of perception, the sculpting potentials of light and color, explorations of instability and gravity, and the use of repetition or serial sequences, for instance, were in fact absolutely of their time." We should note a resurgence of interest in Fabro in the last 5 to 8 years with the recent publication of his interviews and writings, in Italian for now, but hopefully soon in English, thanks to the work of the Archivio Luciano e Carla Fabro and Fabro's daughter, Silvia. There was also a small exhibition of works on paper at the Italian Cultural Institute in New York earlier this year. and more broadly, a resurgence of interest in post-war Italian art, with the recent translation in English of Carlo Lonzi's self-portrait, the Arte Povera show at the Jeu de Paume in Paris in 2022, and of course the current Arte Povera show at the Bourse de Commerce in Paris. So as we continue to rewrite and refine the history of the last 5 decades of art on both sides of the Atlantic, Fabro's crucial contribution is coming into sharper focus and continually acquiring new relevance. So please get your copy of Reinventing Sculpture. Nice transition. And have it signed by the author after the conversation. We're live streaming this event, so you'll be able to see it later on our PCG Studio homepage, and you can share it with friends or return to it. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Margit Rowell and Mathilde Guidelli-Guidi.
And Tilly. Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, everyone at 192 Books and Paula Cooper Gallery. And thank you, Margit. I mean, this is an extraordinary book, I must say. The word that comes to mind is really spacious. There's something extraordinary about how you manage to kind of guide the reader through the work of Fabro, but leaving so much room for the work itself without imposing necessarily your voice, but your voice being completely mediating throughout the images of the work, as well as the words of the artist, as well as the context that, as Anthony was saying, Fabro traversed throughout his career and through his thinking and through his work. So thank you. I met Margit maybe 10 years ago, and at
actually through Paula.
Through Paula,
yeah.
At FIAC, what was once FIAC, on opening day, and Margit asked me, "Oh, you're Italian, you know Fabro?" And I was like, "Oh, Fabro, yeah, the one with the Italy in reverse." and Margit was like, "Shame on you." And I was like, "Oh, what are you doing?" "I'm working on a book on Fabro." And that was, to me, a lesson in this very complex and very also obscure sculptor and artist whose work is, I think, intentionally shape-shifting because it is so directed by testing ideas rather than systems, in a way. So perhaps to begin with, before diving into the book, which again is extraordinary and a real gift, I think, to all of us, I would like to ask you, Margit, a little bit about your first encounter with Fabro's work and your relationship with Fabro as a curator, deciding to work with him on a retrospective of his work.
Well, anyway, thank you, 192 Books. Thank you, Paula. Thank you to many people in this room, including, I would like to name them, Joseph Logan, who designed this beautiful book, and Daisy Charles, who helped bring it to fruition, as it were, and Paul, more than anybody, Paula, who really defended me, because I have to say, the book had a very difficult coming about in that, first of all, it took me 5 years to write it. So it took me 5 years to write it because it was so much more complex than I expected. And then it took me as many years, if not more, to find a publisher because Fabro died and he was no longer visible, and people said, well, if there isn't an exhibition, why should we do a book? And blah, 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 blah. And so, anyway, here we are, and the book is here. I probably met, I was thinking about it. It's a little bit, the dates are a little bit confusing because in 1986, I did an exhibition at the Centre Pompidou. I had just left the Guggenheim, and I was married to a French artist, and so I had French nationality because at that time you had to have that. And I went to the Centre Pompidou and I did this exhibition called Qu'est-ce que la sculpture moderne? And did a whole floor, so to speak, juxtaposing it was just an instinct, but juxtaposing minimalism and arte povera to show that they were of the same time and that they had a lot more in common than we think. And I think that it was in doing my research in Italy at that time that I didn't meet Fabro, but I discovered the work. And then he had an exhibition at the Musée de la Ville de Paris in 1984. My show was in 1986, but I had 3 years to prepare it. And I met him there. And one of the things, if you don't know the work, it's a little bit, well, this is a fairly easy piece to describe. In 1967, in the first Arte Povera show, he showed something called pavimento, which is newspapers on the floor, which was inspired by what women, I have to say women.
Predominantly
women, after they washed the floor, they put newspapers on it so that people wouldn't walk on it and it wouldn't get dirty. And to tell you the truth, when I was growing up in Baltimore, when we washed the kitchen, we had newspapers on the floor. And he did it for the whole upper floor of the Musée de la Ville de Paris. So it was absolutely spectacular. And that must have been like 3,000 square feet or something like that. And it was supposed to be changed every day. But anyway, I met him there. And he was so accessible, and he was so everything, that I just thought, I think I knew already that I was going to be going to the Miro Foundation afterwards, where I was going to have a free hand to do exhibitions of contemporary artists. And I asked him if I could do a show with him. And he said, yes. And so in those days, it was a lot easier to do these things. But, so that was my first meeting with him. I went to Italy quite often to see him, to talk to him about the show. And he took me to wonderful restaurants. He was very bon vivant. We spoke mostly in French. I had a little bit of I had some fluency in Italian, which I've lost since then, but I did do quite a bit of the translating in the book. And it was just, he was an amazingly generous and also very pedagogical. He liked to explain why he was doing things, and it wasn't always an explanation that you understood, but he was very, very generous.
And that kind of led to, as Anthony was saying, to a conversation in which later on Fabro asked you whether you would want to edit a collection of his writings, and then the decision to make this book. And perhaps we can talk a little bit about methodologically how you approached this.
I would like to say something about the writings, because he did approach me and he said he wanted to do an anthology of his writings, and he wanted it to be 1,000 pages, and he wanted it in English for the American public, because he said the American public doesn't really know my work. And I said, but don't you think you should have a book with images? He wanted black and white postage stamp images. And I said, Luciano, people don't know your work. And furthermore, his writings are slightly impenetrable. He came from the Friuli region. His native tongue was Friulani. So that his Italian, I would give it to sort of people who were much better in Italian than I was. And I'd say, what does this mean? And they would say, we don't know. And so translating a whole 1,000 pages into English, it seemed to me absolutely not possible. But I was so thrilled at the idea of working with him, because I thought it would be such a stimulating, extraordinary experience that I accepted. And then he died. And so I said to Sylvia, his daughter, I said, I think it's doing these things backwards. I think he needs a monograph. I think he needs a study of the work. Because I loved the work, but it was very mysterious to me, I have to tell you. And it didn't seem very arte povera, and it didn't seem, it was very hard to know. And so I thought in doing this, I will learn about the work.
Yeah. Yeah, that's quite wonderful, and certainly something that you managed to do, and we can talk a little bit about how you organized precisely this material. Essentially, the book moves through thematic chapters, roughly, sometimes overlapping in terms of their chronological development. And Anthony used the word guide, and really there's a sort of like carrying the reader by hand through the material, thanks to this kind of editing and groupings that you made, but otherwise leaving a lot of room for Fabro's own methodology, which was often to show the work with precisely writing, or almost like, as you said, a pedagogical exercise. So at the same time, you would encounter the work. And since his very first show, he would have what Cameron Rowland today calls extended captions. So this kind of vademecum or pamphlets that you would have, and that would not necessarily have a logical or a direct description or ekphrasis or whatever of the work. It would be an appendage to the work. And somehow that methodology is basically repeated in your book, except, of course, you organized all this through groupings. So perhaps you could tell us a little more about how you approached this very vast body of work and how you went along organizing the material in the book.
Well, I thought, in view of the fact that I had made this promise to Fabro to do something with the writings, I began each chapter with paragraphs from his writing, and I tried to have his voice be heard at several moments during the book, which was, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes a little bit complicated, because translating his Italian into English and having it be crystal clear wasn't always that easy. But the work, the work is very vast, and he would do themes, and then he would come back to them. And so I couldn't really do a chronological outline, so to speak. And what I decided was to do something a little more thematic. I mean, I have to say that I went into this without knowing where I was going, and I always say, during my 35 years as a museum curator, the art tells me what to do. I don't go in with a preconceived idea. And so the very first period of Fabro is very, very minimalist, and then there are areas where it's very Baroque, and there are areas where it's very, he refers to mythology, but these are themes which repeat throughout his work. So I felt I couldn't just do it decade by decade, because there were sort of the same things which came and were developed, and that it would be much more easy to understand to have a chapter on the reference to the Baroque, or a chapter on the reference to perception, well, as Mathilde said, sometimes they overlap, but I think it works. Finally.
Yeah, perhaps we can talk about some of the threads, in fact, that are through the work and that return. And one, certainly space. You begin with this kind of, we are in the early 60s, around 62 is the first work that you discuss. At this point, Fabro, as you said, is born in Turin, right? But then moves to Friuli, and then goes back by kind of end of the 50s. He moves to Milan, and that's where he encounters, like the climate at the time would be definitely Fontana as a central figure, and Fontana predominantly around this thinking about the fourth dimension and space, and then moving into a lot of reading, as well as this constant teaching at the same time, and being interested in pedagogy, which is how he was trained as a teacher, essentially. And the move is then, in terms of the work, very quickly he starts doing these very observational works around space, using materials such as glass paint, like hardware store materials, glass paints or metal rods. Not yet mirrors, but then it would move into mirrors, this kind of more theatrical cubes of mirrors, and then the idea of the cube as a space that encircles you, and then moving into instead these very strange tent-like spaces where the work is an obstruction to actually any passage. Or so thinking about space, which then in a way returns later on in the habitats. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about this thread of space in his practice, and obviously in relation to the art of his time, but perhaps not in North America or even in Northern Europe. How do you think of his work and his thinking of space in a way against some notions of size specificity that were being developed at the time, or even institutional critique that were being developed at the time?
Well, very early on, I'm not going to answer it quite directly, but very
Please.
early on, he developed this idea of the habitat, which would be an environment. He felt that it was very important. When he was an artist of arte povera.
Would you describe one that you like the most? The habitats are gorgeous.
Well, let me just.
Sorry.
He said that it was always important how the work was shown and in relation to what.
Yeah.
And he said that when he went to museums to have exhibitions, because he did have a moment when he was very, very sought after, and he had lots of exhibitions, and he would say, sometimes they give me a space which is pretentious, sometimes they are prestigious, and sometimes they give me a space which is obscene, and I want to make my own space within that space so the work will be seen the way I think it should be seen. And one of his models for these environments, so to speak, was the Italian Baroque piazza, because he said, it's an open space, you arrive at it and it's sort of hidden, you don't see it immediately, and then when you get in it, it feels like it's a closed space, but it's not a closed space because there are roads running off it. And so he said, I want my spaces for my exhibitions to have this both closed and open situation. And then he would, his interest in space, I actually went over and read a few of his lectures to his students. Space is one of his most important subjects, but as one might imagine for a sculptor. So there's a whole chapter about the habitats where he made these environments, sometimes with paper. He developed each one in relationship to the space that was given to him, sometimes with fabric, sometimes with, in Rotterdam, he did one with layers of paper, like a millefeuille, so to speak. And then he would sometimes draw circles on the floor, which would be like Renaissance pavements. I mean, I'm telling you this in such a fragmented way, but he wanted to control the space, the aesthetics of the space, and also how he would show his work in it.
Yeah. Perhaps something to go back to Pavimento that you were mentioning earlier. It's this work that Margit was mentioning, which is part of a group of works that Fabro makes in mid-late 60s.
It was in the first Arte Povera
right.
exhibition in 67.
So Pavimento in particular is 67, and then around that time that he subtitles or groups under the name of tautologies. And that is a very, of course, current word at the time, but Fabro had a very specific acceptation of the word tautology. Could you tell us more about that?
Well, the first group of works were the Italies, which, as Mathilde said, the upside-down Italies, but which he started in the 60s. And he said that he wanted to get away from ideology and he wanted to do an art without filters. And and he said that Italy, the silhouette of Italy is, and I quote him, he said it was an empty cipher, and you can fill it with many different meanings. So over the years, he did 45 of these Italy, mostly hung upside down because he wanted to reverse the hierarchy between the North and the South. And each one has a sociological or an amusing meaning. There is one where the silhouette is very different. It's the silhouette of Italy when it was under Mussolini, where Mussolini had more parts in the northern part than there are now. And then there was one, well, I can't go through the whole list of them, but all of them, sometimes they were also ironic, but not to spend too much time on that. The tautologies, Fabro was very much into real life, so to speak, bringing real life into art and actually, I mean, I told you it was very complex, so excuse me, it's a little bit complex to talk about. But one of my favorite pieces from this period, and this will explain it to you, is called I Lenzuoli. And it's 3 bed sheets hung on the wall, embroidered bed sheets with embroidered pillowcases which have his monogram on them, and they're hanging on the wall, and they have stretchers behind them. And so what Fabro would say about these was that they still had all the presence of domestic life, but they also had this, he didn't want they tread a line between the real and the aesthetic, and that was what he was trying to do. And he also, at the same time, he did something called Il Pupo, which is a baby, and it was a fan, which was covered with a pillowcase, and the fan vibrated, so it was like a baby being shaken or whatever. And so again, it was very close to real life, but also it was an aesthetic object. I should say that when he was doing this is the time that he met Duchamp. Duchamp came to Milan, and
this is the moment when Arturo Schwarz was making multiples of
exactly,
Duchamp.
Exactly. And he said something very interesting, because Duchamp is such an icon here. He said he came to Italy, none of us knew him, and he wasn't well known and he wasn't respected. He said here was this artist looking for a space for himself. And we didn't know him, but obviously he made an impression.
Yeah, perhaps, I mean, the 2 works you mentioned, again, are extraordinary. The Following the Floor that you mentioned earlier, around essentially concealing labor out of the pride, because the pride is in making the work and cleaning the floor, and then concealing it in a way and upkeeping it because it's work that you do for yourself, which is somehow something that was an ethic that he brings in quite a bit in some of his work. But, and then the work that you mentioned about the 3 ways of hanging the sheets, as well as the baby, the fan baby. But this brings to mind a thread in the early work of Fabro, which might or might not be related also to his friendship with Carla Lonzi, but generally speaking, his mother's side. Fabro's mother was a seamstress, and there's a group of work and then a certain attention to craft, and that kind of intimate approach that a seamstress would have in order to try things on you, but at the same time the reserve that really permeates especially the early work, I think. And yeah, there's something about my mother's side that comes to mind when I look at those early works. And I think it's also a lesson in terms of looking at then as this later use of technique. Technique is almost like an alibi for Fabro, the way he uses materials and what from abroad you would say high craft, such as Murano glass and silk, and low materials such as hardware store materials, but in fact, to him, they all are materials that you have to learn how to use and learn by doing in a way. So there's kind of a way of I'm not sure where I'm going with this question, but I guess I'm curious to hear from you a little bit more about how you see, again, if labor and this kind of approach to making, an approach to technique, an approach to materials is are such keywords if we think of the art that comes out of the 60s and 70s, and the relation to fabrication and so forth. Yeah, I'm curious to hear how you see Fabro and how you saw Fabro's work, having worked so closely
Well, the thing
with
is
it.
that what we should remember is this is the 70s and the 80s, and there were a lot of international exhibitions such as When Attitudes Become Form, or all over Europe. And Fabro knew very well. He knew American minimalism. He knew everything. And he once said, because what Mathilde is referring to is this very famous group of works which are called the piedi, or the feet, which had a marble base, which was sometimes like a lion's paw or like a bird's claw, and then a long silk shaft which is attached to the ceiling.
And the first time installed these in Venice.
Yes, he showed them in Venice in 1972, a whole room of them. So it was like this kind of hypo-style hall, in a sense. And what was very important to him, he knew about minimalism and industrial people who worked with ideas and had them realized or had them executed by other people. But he was very much into craft and into domestic activity, I would say. And so that the sleeves in silk, they were sewn by his mother.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing also, with all these different things he did, like the newspapers or like this, everything had to be almost partly crafted at the time of installation, because depending on the height of the ceiling, the sleeve would be higher or lower, and the pavimento was either large or small. So there were all these decisions that you had to make. He was very influenced by John Dewey, and pragmatism during his first studies, his early studies. And this was something that he kept with him all his life, that he wanted the work to be on the edge between reality and down-to-earth reality and art. And also the art, it was also references to the culture of the past, because one of his leitmotifs was that the culture of the past is being lost, humanism is being lost, and he wasn't being retrograde in saying that, but he just said there are things that we have to sort of hold on to, ideas, values, and so that when you see these references of the piedi, which have these long shafts, I mean, they're like antique columns. Sometimes they're white in silk, and sometimes they're fluted. But of course, they're not, because they hold nothing up. And the emphasis is not on the capitals, the emphasis is on the feet. And this, I think both Mathilde and I are sort of going on in an unstructured way. But he said
But the book is very structured.
The idea, well, no, but this is why it took me 5 years to sort of sort through it all. But he said, in Reinventing Sculpture, he said, I don't want it to be modeling around an axis, and I don't want it to be taking away. I want it to be with new materials, non-art materials, or materials that traditionally are used for other things. He used Murano glass, he used marble. He referred to mythology, and all of this was a way of getting away from the industrial aesthetic and the conceptual aesthetic of the time.
Although, of course, at the same time, they are displayed in an array, and they are, if you wish, modular, meaning that they have this kind of...
Yeah.
So There's another body of work. I mean, we spoke about the kind of the most well-known bodies of work, which would be the Italie, the Piedi, as you just said, and then the habitats. There is a group of work where he addresses the question of illusionism and nature through, I mean, there are many works through which he addresses the question of the relationship with nature, but I'm thinking now the relationship with light and kind of how his work is really always across painting and sculpture and the coat hangers, which are this group of works that he made for an exhibition in Naples. Probably, again, another body of work that is quite extraordinary in terms of experiencing it in person. They are in Turin, if you wish to go there. I strongly recommend the trip. But could you tell us a little bit how he arrives at that, and also how he brings this question of the vernacular into these highly fabricated and really spectacular works?
Well, the Atakapani, or clothes hangers, which is the translation, which is much less aesthetic, I might say. They are the original piece. It's 5 different groups of draped canvas, which is folded like this, each one in this, and which is in colors from the start. The first one is in blues and the last one is in oranges, and he said it was something like a sunset. But when I'm not explaining exactly the image, but they make me think very much of Renaissance painting and Piero della Francesca's paintings of dresses of women, where you have this kind of in and out waving. And I'm sure that that's what he was thinking about. And that's why this is part of what I wrote in the chapter on the Baroque, or on the Italian nature of the work. He said that he went to Brazil for the biennial, and he traveled in the country, and he was very impressed by the brilliant colors and by the craftsmanship of the people that he met. And so this is one of his, I might say, this is one of his more, they're very large, and it's one of his more imposing works. But I can't really say where they come from, except to me, they have much more Renaissance feeling in their inspiration than anything else.
Mm. Something you said earlier brings to mind, this brings us a little around the circularity of thematics in the work. I don't know if you know this, but before he passed away, Fabro visited Dia Beacon and proposed a potential sketch for an exhibition there, and it was in circles. So I guess my question is, if you were to curate a Fabro show right now, how would you do it?
That's a very hard question. Because I did curate a Fabro show in Barcelona.
But now, after this.
He was there. And he had very clear ideas about how it should be laid out. But it also must be said that it was at the Muro Foundation, where the rooms were what they were, right? And so there wasn't a whole lot of imagination. Shortly after he died, there was an exhibition at the Madre Museum in Naples, and Sylvia installed it. And Sylvia, his daughter, who actually she trained as a conservator, and after Fabro's wife Carla died, Sylvia accompanied him on for all his exhibitions, and helped him install them and conserve them, et cetera, et cetera. So she knew the work quite well, but she was quite lost as to how to do these installations. because he always had his ideas.
Mhm.
Now there is somebody who works with Sylvia named Andrea, who worked with Fabro also, and so he's sort of the hyphen between Fabro and what one does with the work today. But the exhibition in Rotterdam, he put circles on the
Yeah.
floor. It was a very complex installation. And again, for me, that comes from the whole Baroque idea of Fabro.
And as you said, a lot of kind of all the work needs to be refashioned according, kind of like the site responsiveness of the work, which is, if you wish, also a feature of much of the art of the period, this kind of authorial approach to exhibitions. And actually, Fabro kept a copy of each of his work, or a variant or a version
He
of each of
made
his work.
exhibition pieces, so
Yeah.
to speak.
Perhaps we can open it up to questions.
No, but I would like to say, no, yeah, we can. I just would like to say one thing, which is that if we put this into context, it was really, I mean, he knew, for instance, well, somebody asked him once what he thought of somebody like Smithson. And he said, we were all reading the same things. We were reading Dewey, we were reading Merleau-Ponty, we were looking at the same things, we were looking at, but we had such different backgrounds. We came from such different cultures that there was no way we could do the same thing. And he said, Donald Judd and Phaidon and all of these people, they have their culture they come from, and I have my culture that I come from. And it was very interesting also, he said at a certain point, that the Piedi, these extraordinary sort of surrealist sleeves in silk with a marble, a beautifully sort of archaeologically carved foot, either in Murano glass or in marble. He said it was, in a sense, a response to minimalism and to Carl Andre, to flat stuff on the floor. Right? He said it was my way of saying we do things differently, and we have a different background. And also, I mean, the fact that he used silks and marbles, he did quite a lot of work in marble, but he wanted to show that marble was not something that could only exist in antiquity, that it could have a meaning for today.
Yeah. Well, perhaps just because it's one of his most enigmatic pieces and it's in marble, I can ask you about.
Don't ask me about Lo Spirato.
Yes. There's a word that it's quite extraordinary because Fabro, and it's also extraordinary to see the documentation that is presented here for the first time, as well as the thinking process that Fabro went through. It is a moment in which he's thinking about negative space, as well as Margit was saying, marble, and he's very much looking at like George Siegel or Bruce Nauman and people who work in that idiom, and that is kind of something he does not want to do in terms of both the question of casting and then the question of negative space and the figure as kind of this intermediary between the two. So again, Siegel and Nauman as two examples of artists who contend with those questions at, in the which years the Spirato? Early 70s?
Yes.
Anyway, what does he do? He, again, lies on a mattress in his studio and covers himself with a drape, a piece of cloth, a sheet, and then cuts himself off and then tries to have this carved in marble, thinking that the picture would be safe.
No, wait, but then he pours plaster over it to
It
stiffen it.
To stiffen the sheet.
And then he crawls out of it. I mean, what you have to imagine is a lying figure, like a tomb figure in a Gothic church or something, and it's in marble. But the first thing that you notice is that it doesn't have a head, right? And
but the feet are quite.
It does have feet. And apparently, he made this thing with other artist friends, he got into it, and then he realized it was hardening, and that he would have to break it to get out. So he got out, and they made a mannequin of his same size, and they did it over again with the mannequin, actually. But there are photographs where you see the young Fabro with the sheet up to here. And what is interesting about this piece, I mean, there are lots of things that are interesting about it, and when it is shown, people say, "Oh, well, there's no head. What is this about?" And then there are people who say, "Oh, well, it's like a religious figure," but Fabro was not religious at all, and he.
Well, we can say it was shown at Contemporanea, which is this very important show that, like post-Celland, Achille Bonito Live organizes in Rome in a parking lot, and that's where Beuys shows Arena for the first time. So, like, it's kind of
it's considered a very, very radical piece, and in fact, but
and in lieu of a car, it just parks diagonally himself in marble, and then he leaves.
What we were saying earlier is it was very important for him how things were exhibited. And this piece, he was very interested in the curator. And so this lying marble sculpture, you see it in like you imagine it in an empty square in a de Chirico painting. It takes that with it as well. But then, as Mathilde said, it was shown in a parking lot.
Underground garage.
Yeah, okay. Yes, an underground garage. And it was shown, I saw it shown, it was shown at the Reina Sofia in absolutely a vast, vast space. And everywhere it is shown, it has a huge presence, but which is somewhat different in each particular space.
Yeah, very contextual. And I think in certain moments, I guess what I was trying to bring up is also his sense of humor, and which definitely... especially in group shows, seems to come out quite a bit. And your book kind of shows that through images again, as well as the context that you give.
Okay.
I think it's time. I'm looking at the time.
It's
time for questions?
Yeah.
So I guess we'll open up for questions. Any question? Yes.
Congratulations on your book. It looks very beautiful. At what point does Fabro does he articulate to himself the necessity of reinventing sculpture? And at what point does that occur?
I'd say very early on, actually. I mean, with Arte Povera. He started out as an informel painter, right? No one has ever, except Sylvia, I guess, no one has ever seen any of these paintings. But Fontana was one of his heroes, and he came to Milan to be near Fontana, whom he knew. Fontana bought a piece from his first exhibition, but Fontana was very loyal to younger artists. And he said to me, the first time I met him, he said, "You know, I was an Arte Povera artist for 2 years. And after that, there was nothing more for me to say, because he said I wasn't interested in raw materials and all that kind of thing. I had to go my own way." And so his own way, immediately what he started doing was the Italia in different materials. Some of them are covered with fur, sometimes they're covered with mirrors, and
in lead, a lot of lead, which is so beautifully,
yes. Yeah.
Again, this kind of sartorial elegance almost.
And then he did, at the same time, he did a piece of fern, which is mounted on a lead plate. And he explained that for him, the fern is a very, very ancient vegetal or whatever. And that by mounting it the way he mounted it, of course, he changed it completely. But he kept the memory of it.
But perhaps also in terms of like a theoretical text would be the text on the haptic. That's
Yes,
a
well,
moment in
that
which it
was-
summarizes a lot of the ideas up to that time.
Well,
Which year
yes,
is that?
Yes, I would say so. That was,
Late
Yeah.
70s?
it was what?
Late 70s?
Yeah, late 70s.
So late 70s, it does write a first kind of manual of sort.
I think one of the reasons he did was it was also, it was a period when figuration was coming back,
Mm.
and
So maybe mid 80s.
yeah, it was a little later. And he felt that he had to defend sculpture in some way. And so he wrote this little book with a critic, Yoli de Sana. She signed it, but we think he wrote it. And he was also teaching at Carrara quite early on, and then he came and taught at the Brera. And his teachings are very, very interesting. His teachings are, it's very, very, very broad, from space to gesture to metaphysics to, but it's also, it's very interesting, but it's also a little vague at times. You have to really plug into it.
Mm.
So I would say that since 1967, I mean, he was, although maybe he didn't verbalize it immediately from the beginning, but I would say he did verbalize it starting in about, he did in his interviews for Domus and for the magazines at that time. He was very clear about it.
Mm.
Why do you think he made a break from arte povera?
I think all the arte povera artists had their own personalities, so to speak. And first of all, he said that arte povera was really a very artificial idea. It was, some people say it was a marketing idea because in '64, Rauschenberg got the Grand Prix at the Venice Biennale, and all of a sudden, Europeans were sitting up and taking notice of American art. It was also the period of in the 50s, it was the period of the Italian miracle with Fiat and Olivetti, et cetera, and so the arte povera artists, they were founded in wanting to go away from all of that, from consumer culture, et cetera, and each one had his own way of moving away from it. And I think Fabro, who can say? No, I can't really say, but it became immediate. I think that was what was so mysterious to me. It became immediately very elegant and very historically charged, and very different from Cunelis or from Anselmo.
One more question.
I was struck too at that you spoke about how Duchamp was not at all a reference, or was somebody that he and his group of the group of artists around him looked at. But then in the 90s, he starts doing the nudie.
Yes,
these
yes,
sort
that's
of,
true. Okay.
Stone descending a staircase in a sense, and he refers to Duchamp in several different works. Do you think that was purely parodic, like a parody, or like an inside joke, or was he really trying to contend with something in Duchamp's legacy?
He went through a period at the end where he did large installations, and there were references to Mondrian, and there were references to Duchamp. And he said that he had gotten to a point where he wanted to parody earlier artists, and he wanted to parasite them. Can you say that? And then at a certain point, he said he was going to parody himself, and so he came back to certain things that he had done before. But there is a large piece called Nudes Descending a Staircase Dancing the Boogie Woogie, right? And it's a piece which is probably as big as this room, and which obviously has nothing to do with Duchamp, but obviously for him it has everything to do with Duchamp.
Mm.
I'm afraid it's been very fragmented, what we've been saying to you, but
Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Margit.
The next event at the bookstore will be on December 3rd. Is that right? December 3rd, and it will be a conversation between Merve Emre and Carla Kelsey on two Mina Loy books and a selection of short stories by Juna